over 30 summit meetings, which could be just one-on-one, of presidents with foreign leaders, both in public and behind the scenes. And I've never seen anything like this. The only one I ever heard of, which might have been as bad, but I was not present, was when at the time of Selma, 1965, when Governor Wallace was summoned to the Oval Office, and I was told about it right afterwards, in which Wallace said to Johnson, "Good morning, Mr. President." And for the next 45 minutes, he was not allowed to say another word, as Johnson just ripped him up and ripped him down and then threw him out of the White House and went before the cameras and proclaimed that he was going to do a Voting Rights Act. But in terms of leaders with one another, it never happens like that. And I know that Mr. Zelensky should have kept his cool, but you got to understand, here's a guy whose country is at war, and they've lost hundreds of thousands of people. The United States hasn't lost anybody for quite some time. Maybe we lost 3 or 4 people here and there out in the Middle East. We haven't been at war for quite some time, not since 2003 and the aftermath in what happened in Iraq. And that's number one. Number two, Zelensky came to Washington expecting to do a deal. The deal was to be he would sign an agreement in which the United States would get paid by having access to rare earths and that sort of thing, in exchange for which Zelensky would get security guarantees from the United States. And Trump indicated he wasn't going to deliver. And in fact, he was going to want to get paid up front with a rare earth deal, but give Zelensky nothing. In fact, if you look back, that has been Trump's negotiating style throughout his history. The number of bankruptcies, the number of times he was sued, the number of times he walked away from payments to people who worked for him. I mean, this is just the kind of guy he is. I got to tell you. And then Vance, who was obviously primed to go at some point, I got to tell you, I was ashamed for my country. Now, I know people are out there saying, oh, Zelensky should have behaved and he should have made nice. He should have done what the British Prime Minister did, who came in and said, oh, you're the most wonderful president ever. And by the way, the king is inviting you to an unprecedented meeting at Buckingham Palace in London. You know, that was just toed in. And the British Prime Minister went away with absolutely nothing. He made himself look stupid. And Macron didn't care, because Macron would just as soon America butts out anyway, because he continues to have the French illusion that I am going to run Europe. Well, of course, he's not going to run Europe. And I'm not sure there's going to be a Europe to work on. I just saw a crawler which said Ernest Bevin once threatened to punch Molotov in a meeting, and I kind of wish that that Bevin had punched Molotov. Molotov was one of the stellar.
Is there ever, does it break down into physical things? I mean, and I asked that because I was in Afghanistan. Like, sometimes I get to be in the Rose Garden too, and the governor of the most populous province, state, or county, if you want to, in a state, was getting directed and pushed by the State Department. And they keep bringing this guy in who was a shit stirrer from within the Afghan populace. Like, this is going to be the guy. And the governor's like, no, he's not. So the governor and that dude had to stand up, and they had to settle whether he was or he wasn't. And then they settled it, and that guy left. The next State Department crew comes in, and they're like, hey, here's your guy. And he's like, no, that motherfucker's had his ass kicked once already in here, and I'll do it again. And we had to like calm the State Department people down, because they had one lever. They just kept pulling it. Here's Jim lever. Bring Jim in. And Jim wasn't going to happen. And so, these things can, to my experience, can get physical.
Even at Yalta, just 80 years ago, just last month, actually, where you have Stalin, who was this butcher, with Roosevelt, there was not a cross word spoken at Yalta because, of course, everybody there, along with Churchill, understood that they had real business to get done, and losing your cool was just going to be terrible. It was kind of like if at the point where Stalin wanted something on Poland and FDR didn't give it to him, that if he'd said to FDR, "Get out of here, go home, until you're ready to give me what I want." Come on, give me a break. That didn't happen. Didn't
Yeah.
happen. It didn't happen. All right, now let me recycle for a second.
Please.
That's media stuff, okay? Everybody loves that, and I think almost as many people will tune in tonight to hear Mr. Trump's version of events on national television, 8 o'clock. Almost as many who watch Saturday Night Live, because it's going to be about as entertaining. Okay,
Yeah.
so here we go. And I don't blame Zelensky. I wish he kept his cool, but so what? Here's a guy who's being dissed by the president of the United States, who's being done in, who's having a deal taken away from him. Is being cheated by the president of the United States. I mean, there's no fair person who can argue with that because that was what was going on, and it was teed up that way. And then Trump decided, well, I just am not going to do that until he pays me up first. Wait a second. If you go buy a used car, are you going to pay the used car dealer before he delivers the car? Come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Give me a break.
Right.
Doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Maybe it does in New York real estate, but it doesn't happen elsewhere. Oh, no, let me, if I might take a minute to
Please.
say the only good thing perhaps I'll say about Trump in what he's been doing. He understands something very, very fundamental, that Russia is on its back feet right now, but at some point it's going to be a great power again. And there are going to be three great powers in the world: the United States, China, Russia, and if they ever got their act together, the European Union, with India coming up on the outside. But that's it, okay? Well, we have pretended, we as a nation, under 4 presidencies now, including Trump 1. He keeps saying, I never lost any territory when I was president, and my Obama did, and then Biden did, and all that. He forgets, and there's no media people smart enough to say to him, well, Mr. Trump, Russians were occupying Crimea and the Donbass under your watch, and what did you do to push back? Oh, I sent him some javelins, which is a kind of missile. Well, he said the war wouldn't have happened if I'd been president the second time back. Well, it was already happening. And if you weren't going to push back when you were president, and he didn't, why would the Russians think you would push back if you'd been reelected back then? That was just a big lie, all right? But the journalists let him get away with it. Okay. But that's small potatoes. All right. So Trump recognized that Russia's going to be big power. We're going to have to deal with it. Now, the last president who really understood that, the last 2 presidents, were George H.W. Bush, who in 1989 talked about what we want to do is get a Europe whole and free and at peace, even before the Cold War came to an end. That meant more than anything else, doing a future without pushing Russia away, the way Germany in 1914 was forced to take full responsibility for World War I, and Hitler went to town on it in a wonderful time, with the German people saying, see what they just did to us. So Bush was determined, and Clinton was determined, we are not going to push the Russians down while they're down. We're not going to tell them they're nobody. We're not going to push you away, because we know at some point we're going to have to deal with you. And it was working very well up until more or less the end of Clinton. I was involved. I did a lot of the negotiating. I put together more than anybody else, the grand strategy, putting the pieces together. I helped invent a thing called Partnership for Peace, one of the best things NATO did in that period, and I got Russia to join it.
Yeah.
When it came to the NATO, when we were compensating Ukraine, there was the NATO-Ukraine Charter to balance the NATO-Russia Founding Act. I negotiated that, not just on behalf of the United States, but on behalf of NATO. All right, so that worked until we all left government and a bunch of neocons came in, American neocons, some of which are still in the government.
Yeah.
One of the primary people was brought back in by Biden. No idea. I was just a gross incompetence. But from then on, the presidents and their teams were saying, Russia's of no account. Who cares? We can do what we want to them. And it got to the magic moment in 2008 in which, under pressure from George W. Bush, who wanted to bring Ukraine into NATO, and people said, are you kidding? That's like, I'm sorry to bore your audience, that's like when there was the Soviet-Cuban alliance at the end of Eisenhower.
Yeah.
Happens, we did the Bay of Pigs. There was no threat to reality. We did the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy learned a big lesson from that, which helped to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we helped cause, incidentally. You won't find that in the mainstream media. It's a fact.
Well,
We put in Turkey. We put nuclear missiles in Turkey.
right.
And Russians who were way behind us in nuclear weapons said, okay, I guess we better put some nuclear missiles close to America. Big mistake out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so one of the parts of the deal was we took our missiles out of Turkey. Shh.
Mm.
And we kept our mouths shut for 3 years on that. It took us 3 years before somebody figured out what happened to those missiles in Turkey. Oh, shh. We took them out and didn't speak up about it. I mean, come on. All right. So here we are. Russia couldn't tolerate it, being NATO having been too close. And also, in that statement, 2008, NATO, under U.S. pressure, said the following: Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO allies. I was across the street at a meeting that I was chairing of a thing called the Atlantic Treaty Association. This was in Bucharest. And I instantly recognized, as did a lot of other people, that was the moment of commitment. That was the moment we'd agreed to take Ukraine in NATO. The president of Georgia said, oh, we're going to come in too. So I'm going to grab back the parts of my country occupied by the Russians. He went in. He started that war. And the Russians pushed back. And in 5 days, Mr. Saakashvili, who was a piece of work, was out of business. And I said at the time, I hope we don't do something stupid with regard to Ukraine. But year after year after year, we kept saying, NATO, we become a member of NATO. Now I'm going to tell you, I'm sorry, I'm taking people into the nuts and bolts here, but they matter.
Yeah.
The fact is, to join NATO requires following NATO procedure. Most people don't know every decision ever taken at NATO since its founding has been done by consensus, by unanimity. One country, it was 16 when I was there, it's now 32, can put its hand up and say, Mr. Secretary General, I won't sign on to this. That's the end of it. So what you need is 32 countries to say Ukraine can come into NATO. And there are at least half a dozen NATO countries which say, oh, sure, we're going to do that. Doesn't matter now, it's not a real issue, but who are lying. And that includes the Germans and the French and probably the British. They're never going to accept these people. Because it means defending Ukraine against a Russian renewal of a war. And if indeed they believe that, they'd have troops in Ukraine today. So that's been
just a lot. You're saying a lot of things. And by the way, just for anybody who doesn't realize,
that does not in any regards justify anything that Putin did, anything.
Sure.
Though I will say, when he went into 2014, It came 2 weeks after an assistant secretary of state ran a coup in Kiev to replace the sitting government with one of our guys. How do I know
Yeah.
that?
Mm.
Because she did it at an
Mm.
open telephone line. We spend $1 billion a year on secure telephone lines. She did it at an open telephone line. The Russians picked it up and put it on the internet.
Yeah.
It's on the internet today, both the voice and the text of her running a coup.
Yeah.
And you don't know whether that had an impact on Putin, but he loved it because
Well,
the reason I went in is because America ran a coup, which we did.
yeah, we did. We
Trump
did.
didn't do anything about it any more than anybody did. But there was nothing to justify what happened 3 years ago with the Russian coming in to Ukraine. So, but the one thing that Trump has done that his predecessors didn't since late Clinton was to say, we cannot ignore Russia. I don't like the way he's going on about it, but at least he's understood a fundamental fact of life that you can't pretend Russia doesn't exist.
Right.
Now, the way he's done it, by cozying up to Putin, by calling Zelensky a dictator, by throwing him out of the White House, threw him out of the White House. And he says, well, we can get moving when Zelensky comes back to apologize. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? Think about it. It's like you're saying to your spouse, you can come back and we can have a conversation, but you have to apologize to me first.
Yeah.
What do you think the chances of that happening? This is for great powers. On top of which, yesterday, Trump announced that he's cutting off all military aid to Ukraine to stop it from being able to defend itself, and tells Zelensky apologizes and comes back. That's fundamentally against the fundamental interests of the United States of America. So what do we have to do? We need to get people started behaving like grown-ups, getting a process of negotiations going, which everybody now seems to be ready to do, but not having decided on a way to do it. And incidentally, this idea of the Europeans who are scared to death and fit to be tired, every single country in the world denounced what Trump and Vance did in the Oval Office, except for 2 countries and some little countries that do whatever we want. One was China, who's still trying to figure it out, and Putin was delighted. And the Pentagon and the Putin as Kremlin has said so. We're delighted. Now, if you like that, when you get and of course, a few of the Republicans in Congress, but they're all a bunch of eunuchs. I'm sorry to say that because they don't want to get primaried. They're afraid of Mr. Musk and they're afraid of the president and all that kind of stuff. Just they've given up their birthright. It's a sad thing to say. Now,
but let me jump in here. So first off, I wanted to also say, and a thing that I've been talking about, because we often lose sight of our role in all of this stuff, right? And I know some Ukrainians. I know warlords. I know how a lot of these things work. And it is true, and I know you know about this, but Russia deployed with NATO in the last 30 years, right? And you were a part of that. And so we have found a way to work with these guys in the past. But it's also true that we have not. I'm going to be a little bit unfair, but that's how you have to start these conversations.
I hope so.
Our foreign policy class, there are a lot of people that have a lot of letters in front of their name that were desperate, spoiling for a fight with Russia. We've been training for it and fantasizing about it. I would even say fetishizing. And nobody who makes a lot of money in DC, with this in their back pocket, none of them want to walk away from it and say, no, we should take a different approach. A lot of folks were just, I don't want to say they were excited, but they were like, I told you so, even though they've said it for the last 30 years. And so I have a problem with a bit of that, especially when we do things like interfere with other people's elections. We don't like that when it happens to us, but we do that.
World War II, we've done it 82 times. It's a fact.
Right.
We've done it 82 times. In fact, I helped do it once.
No.
Carter administration.
Breaking.
It worked out pretty well, but I helped do it once. Okay, so I know what it is. Incidentally, what you've just said, you don't see this in the mainstream media in America. It is suppressed. You
Yeah.
don't hear it from the major think tanks. It's suppressed
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
people are not willing to say, "Hey, maybe we ought to be doing something differently." You're right. When we had the war in Bosnia, and I was at NATO at the time, we got it stopped, and the Russians supported us in the NATO air campaign. They didn't join, but they support us. And afterwards, we put in an implementation peacekeeping force into Bosnia, right?
Right.
Russians came to us and said, "We want to be part of that." And we said, "Sure, we'd be delighted to have you." They say, "This is the big time, and we want to be part of this peacekeeping." And they said, "Well, we got a problem. We got a problem. We can't put our troops under NATO because they've been the enemy."
Right.
The commanding U.S. general, four-star George Jawan, who is both the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO and head of American forces in Europe, or the Allied Command Europe. He had two hats, one an Allied hat, pure and simple, the other a U.S. Pentagon hat. So he came up with a big chart and he said, "I'll tell you what," he said to the Russian Minister of Defense, who was also a five-star, and it happened in my office in front of me, put up this big chart. He said, "I know," and he drew all these diagrams. He said, "I know you can't put your troops under NATO." "Oh, no, absolutely. But how about if you just put them under an American?" "Oh, that's fine. We can handle that. And that puts us back in the league. That's a superpower, etc." Like we were on the Elba in 1945. I agree to that. Okay. So they agreed to put their troops, and were extremely effective. They sent their very best people under the American general, who just happened to be the same person who was the NATO general. As long as you don't say that's what you're doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
look for the Americans, but not for NATO. But we take commands from the same person. That broke down in the early 2000s, as the people you're talking about.
Yeah.
This is Guatemala with nuclear weapons. Screw them. And it was downhill ever since. Now, Putin at one point went to Munich and gave a speech, 2007. I was there at the time. And everybody said, "Here is Putin trying to start a new Cold War." Go back and read the speech. He was saying, "I like President Bush. We would kind of like to cooperate, but here's the way you guys aren't willing to do it." Go back and read it. Well, maybe he wasn't going to do it anyway. And then the next day, what was our response? To say Ukraine can come into NATO. All right, that's history. You can't deal with that. The thing is, what do you do now?
Right.
What you do now is you get Mr. Vance to shut up. You get Mr. Trump to stop punishing our guy. And you get, let me tell you, it's like, I think it was Dwight Eisenhower once said, if you devise a good plan, then any captain in the military can implement it. Okay. So the way of doing this is pretty simple. You get the Russians in the room, you get America in the room, you get the Ukrainians in the room. You can't do anything without them being in the room, without their being in the room. We tried that. I've been around a while. 1968, we went to Paris and negotiated with the North Vietnamese in Paris, but we excluded the South Vietnamese because that's what the North Vietnamese wanted. And so the talks broke down. We were negotiating behind their back. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You can't do that. You got to have them in the room. And also the Europeans say, "Well, wait a second. We're going to have to pick up the pieces if they're going to be in guarantees. You can't leave us out." Well, you can structure that in a way so everybody's in the room and you can work out a deal. And if you want, I can tell you what the deal would be.
Well, let's hear it. Let's hear it. What's the deal?
First, let's forget about Crimea.
Okay.
Nobody wants Crimea, really. I have joke for everything. And my joke is that Zelensky sits down with Putin, and Putin says, we've been in Crimea except for the naval base. These are tough people, and it's just a drain on our treasury. You take back Crimea. Zelensky says, oh, no, no, no. I don't want the burden of Crimea. You keep it. You stole it fair and square. Now, that wouldn't happen, but that's a reality. Okay. So what you do is you say, okay, and this at one point was worked out until Putin broke his word. Zelensky said that to Trump in the Oval Office the other day, and Trump pretended that Zelensky was lying. He wasn't. There was a negotiation. They agreed on some key principles, and Russia broke it. Okay. Just as Russia broke when they invaded Ukraine, an agreement that was worked out in 1994 to get Ukraine and the three other countries, Kazakhstan and Belarus, two other countries, to give up nuclear weapons left over for the Cold War in exchange for pledges. United States, Russia, Britain, with France and China signing on, there shall not be any invasion by any of the five of our countries in Ukraine. Well, Russia broke that. Okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't give you a lot of confidence. So here's the deal. Here's the deal, as Joe Biden would say. Here's the deal. Ukraine gets sovereignty over the occupied territories. That's a legal fiction, okay? But agrees to give autonomy, individual voting rights and all that, to the parts of Ukraine which are majority Russian-speaking, majority cultural. And something people forget is that before 2014, the Ukrainian government said, I'm terribly sorry, those parts of Ukraine, before the invasion, you can't speak Russian anymore. You can't teach it in the schools. You can't do this, you can't do that. In other words, screw you Russian speakers, Russian cultural people in Ukraine.
Right.
Which was one of the reasons for the invasion. Okay, so you go back to that. And then then the Russians would have to withdraw their forces. And then you put peacekeeping forces in the Russian side, or some Russian troops, and on the western side of this line that's to work out, you have forces from someplace, peacekeeping forces, but with Europeans, and then you have security guarantees from the Europeans backed by the United States. The Secretary of Defense in Munich and the President of the United States have said, we will not give guarantees to Ukraine of its sovereignty. We will not send any of our troops there to take part in this. Don't believe me. Look it up. It's on the internet. It's said over and over again. It's all out there. We're in effect saying, if we get this war started, bye-bye, have a nice day. Well, the rest of the Europeans, at least who live in that part of the world, are terrified.
Yeah.
They say if Russia can't be relied upon to keep its word, and we Europeans will never get our act together, the only way they get their act together is part of NATO. NATO, the 32 countries, Allied Command Operations, which is the 31 countries, Iceland doesn't have any troops, working together under the command of an American general, okay, with common standards, common this, common that, common plans, all of it. Without NATO, the Europeans will always be sixes and sevens because they have to have American, we've been for the last 80 years, to do most of the organizing. It's cheap. It's cheap. Trump goes on about how much, already talks about how much money we put into Ukraine, okay? But he talks about how much money we put into NATO. The NATO allies got to spend more money. Oh, and they've got to spend not 2% of gross domestic product. I'm sorry, all these details matter. They got to spend 5%. How much does the United States spend? We spend on our entire military budget. So you look it up. Look it up. Take you 2 minutes. 3.6% of American gross domestic product goes to defense. What's the European portion of that? well under 1%. We are spending on European security less than every other single NATO country. Well, we pretend, oh, if there were any need, the entire American defense establishment would be there defending a European ally. That's rubbish. How are you going to take the Seventh Fleet from off China and move it to where? Move it to the Black Sea? What are you going to do? Come on, give me a break.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody in the business who's not drinking the Kool-Aid, who just want a job in government, want a job in a think tank, want to write op-eds for the Washington Post, New York Times, or get interviewed in CNN or Fox. Everybody, they all know it, but some of them won't say it. You won't get on television anymore. You won't get admitted to you won't get published in the big newspapers, except maybe the Wall Street Journal. I didn't say that, did I?
You might have said it. Yeah. But I want to jump in with a question.
Okay,
So when we look at everything that's happening, Zelensky at some point, he is the subordinate. He is almost like he's our client, right? And so we've taken care of him to a certain point. And I don't know how much he understands this, but we've had a change of management. And so this new management's like, hey, we're not going to do the same thing. And I think the populace also doesn't want to dig into their pockets to go send however many $1 billion over there, right?
Who doesn't want to dig into their pocket?
The American people. We don't want to dig in our pocket and send $40 billion over to Ukraine. I don't think that there's a general consensus on that.
Of course not.
So we have this changeover, and I don't know if other countries or other people from other countries get like how dramatic these changes can be, right? From Joe Biden's administration to Donald Trump's. It's not an endorsement of either of them. I'm just there's a change there, right? And so when you come in and you have been backed by an administration, by a style, like getting pieces written for you in Vogue and that kind of thing. Okay, great. That treatment is over. Like now you have this new person you have to deal with. You have a new sales rep. And this person says, we're not going to go down that route. Here is the route that I want to take. President Trump gets to pick that approach. And he gets to say, this is the way we're going. And if Zelensky doesn't want to get into line, then I don't blame any leader that says either get in the line or there's no deal or we're leaving, right? And because I think we all know that Zelensky's going to go back in and take the best deal he can get. President Trump wasn't wrong in saying he's got a bad hand of cards. And that's internationally. If you look internally, too, the way that Zelensky's behaved is also creating problems for himself. So I don't know how Zelensky should have acted, but I don't know that there's any recourse except for him to act out in some way because, hey, like I'm running out of opportunities here, right? If someone came in tomorrow and said, hey, we're going to get you out of this office and threw down a coup, we wouldn't be surprised. He has a lot of problems. I don't know how he solves them. And I don't know that he gets how our system works and how our reluctance to pay a bunch of money is going to impact his ability to remain in power long term. And I don't know that his safety is all that guaranteed 2 years from now, because again, he's playing with a lot of rough people and he hasn't been a saint. He's done a lot of, if we all talked about in the press, the things that Zelensky does, and this is a Ukrainian thing, not just a Zelensky thing, we'd be pretty shocked about how we haven't been allowed. This is a fact. We haven't been allowed to be open about Zelensky's actions in the press. It's just not allowed to be talked about.
Well, everything he said has been in the press all the time. What Trump should have done, and that's why some people believe it was a setup. Certainly what Vance said was a setup. All right. You just look at the way it was done. What was proper was for Trump to say, welcome, President Zelensky. Good to have you here. We got a lot of business to be done. Now let's go into the Oval Office and talk about it. The last time something stupid like the alternative was done, really stupid, was at the beginning of the Biden administration when Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Secretary of Defense Blinken went to Anchorage and met with our Chinese counterparts. Instead of saying, welcome to Anchorage, I'm sorry you're not here for the Iditarod, and it's wonderful to have you here. Now let's go and talk. We're going to have a rough talk, but let's do it. Instead, for 16 minutes, they lectured the Chinese.
Oh, boy.
And so the Chinese got out their stopwatch and they lectured us for 16 minutes. And we never recovered in our relations with China. Okay, so instead, this was sort of a setup. And one of the things, if you look at it, which is, and I'm a junkie on this thing, some reporter, and I don't know where he was from, started out and they got the Q&A, which you shouldn't have had a Q&A then. Though there's, as was once said about a senior Democratic member of the Congress, whose name I better not mention, it's the majority leader to minority leader of the Senate, Mr. Schumer. The most dangerous place in Washington is between Mr. Schumer and a television camera. Okay, well, that's true with Trump. You turn on the television, and that's catnip. All right, it's catnip.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of presidents are like that.
Yeah.
Some understand the value of words. Most presidents do. He doesn't understand it. Well, that's fine. It's his way of doing it.
Right.
Well, this reporter says, Mr. Zelensky, why don't you wear a suit when you come in here into the Oval Office?
Right.
Remember seeing that?
Yeah.
Well, when you go to a meeting, it's not just for the folks here, it's also for the folks back home. And that's become his uniform for the folks back home. I mean, hell, Mr. Musk comes into the Oval Office in a T-shirt and a MAGA cap. I mean, that's an insult. That's an insult to do. If you look at it these ways about how you dress, okay. I'm going to say, oh, shut up! I don't care how he's dressed. And then another thing they forget is, I was in a thing the other day, and I saw there was when I was at the gym and in the elevator. And there was a veterans thing going on in the ballroom. And some guy with his wife gets on and he's wearing this uniform I didn't recognize. I asked him about it. He said, well, this is U.S. Army uniform. And it was a brand new one. So it'd been in Class A or the formal thing like that. I didn't recognize it because it changed its color a little bit. Well, if you go into the Pentagon, every single officer in the Pentagon wears a battle dress. Are they going to invade the Pentagon? They wear their campaign boots? Are they going to do that because of solidarity with the people in the field? The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff wears battle dress. Come on, give me a break. Sort of like the old Chinese People's Liberation Army, where they didn't even wear insignia. So the guy is sitting there, and if he had shown up in a suit, people back home would say, what the hell are you doing, Mr. President?
Yeah.
And Trump should come to his support then, as any gentleman would have done.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah. I want to say this. I wouldn't at all minded if President Trump had said, shut your trap, because it's not his meeting. Nobody asked you to talk. Wait your turn. And then, defended, Zelensky. And Zelensky also said, I don't know if you've seen this, but he said, we're at a time of war. I'll come back when it's not war, and I'll wear a suit then. And look, that gets to be okay. There's a cultural thing there. When sheikhs show up or, Arab leaders, they wear, their version of formal dress. It's certainly not a suit, So if someone comes in with the dress that they wear when they run, look, he's the commander in chief. He sets the uniform for the day. If he's wearing that, that's his uniform.
A major leader from a Arab country showed up. He'd be wearing the full kit, right. Except the president of Egypt, who wears a dress suit. The king of Jordan. They both have very good London tailors. Okay, because of the internal politics. But if you're a Saudi leader, you show up in this kit that you keep in the closet somewhere, only when you have to show your people back home that you haven't abandoned them. Okay, so we got to get beyond what happened the other day. Mm-hmm. It was catnip to Trump because if you don't apologize, I'm not going to deal with you. I've already used the image of a spouse.
Right.
If somebody would say to the spouse, you can talk to me only when you apologize, where are the divorce lawyers? Okay.
Right.
Come on, give me a break, unless you have who's just a nobody. So I've already given you, and I can repeat it if you want, the formula for resolving this. If Putin is serious, I know Zelensky is serious. What does he want to do with more people getting killed? And he was the aggressed against party.
Right.
And Trump goes around pretending, and he did say at one point, Ukraine started this war. The president of the United States said that publicly.
No.
And you say, what? What? It reminds me, and I'm not that old, but it's a true story. On September 1st, 1939, even before you were born, you're younger than me, come on.
Yeah.
Hitler dressed a bunch of people out of the concentration camps, dressed them up in Polish uniforms, and took them out to the Polish-German border and shot them, and then say, here was the Polish invasion of the Third Reich.
Mm.
And that's in effect what Trump was endorsing. Don't say he's like Hitler, but it was the same tactic, which is, oh no, Ukraine invaded Russia. Well, if you get past that, and if we had a grown up right now, and even the Secretary of State is not prepared to stand up to Putin on this, they're all scared to death. They're all scared to death of him because they don't, at least for a while. James Carville, as we all know, the Democratic guy, he said the Democrats could keep their mouths shut for a while and let these guys do it to themselves. For example, tonight there are a number of Democratic senators who are not going to the Trump speech. That's a mistake. He's the president of the United States speaking to Congress. You can go there and sit on your hands if you want, but don't boycott it. Because the great American people aren't going to blame Trump. They're going to blame, it's just sometimes very tough.
Yeah.
Now, Biden could have done the opening to Russia if he'd wanted to. Why he didn't do it, I have no idea. You can ask him. Partly because for the last year of his presidency, like Reagan, in the last 3 years of his presidency, was not entirely there.
Right.
It's not entirely there. You could see it. And what happened in the debate with Trump, I am told, because I haven't seen Biden for a number of years, merely ratified what people in the White House had already seen.
Yeah.
Nobody was prepared to say, Mr. President, for the good of the country, you've got to get out now so we have time to pick a real candidate, not somebody you invited. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. I've just given you the way to do it, and I've also given you what the outcome could be. But it does depend upon the United States, and this would be with agreement with the Russians. It's got to be involved in that. And you could have a joint inspection team with people on both sides of the whatever the line turns out to be. People don't remember, again, during the Cold War, in Germany, divided Germany, there was, and because it was basically Americans for NATO and the Soviet Union for the Warsaw Pact, there were American military people who were in Eastern Germany inspecting things, and there were Soviets in West Germany inspecting things at the height of the Cold War. Well, it can be done.
It can be done.
If Putin wants to end it, and I can't see why he wouldn't, and Zelensky clearly wants to end it, the Europeans want to end it. I think Trump would like to end it, but he wants it on where I can get my Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, give me a break. You put me in charge of this for a month, and I'll get you a
month. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Peace.
Let me ask you this. So when we have all this going on, these negotiations, why would Putin trust us, especially Donald Trump? Right? He's not the most trustworthy guy, and I don't blame Ukraine for saying, "Hey, Putin has continued to do this over and over and over again." It's not the same as the deceit that goes on between Gaza and Israel, but there's a lot of problems with their relationship, and you're going to try to make this deal happen, right? But Russia and Ukraine in a month, Russia and Ukraine are still going to be neighbors. They still need to do business together, and so we can't have so much bad blood and so much corruption that business can't transact in a healthy way to allow that region to hopefully heal and grow and go forward, instead of having this continued state of conflict or DMZ or whatever has to be there.
Well, we could get on to Arab-Israeli if you want, but it's really quite different. You do
Okay.
have blood on both sides, etc. But in this case, you can look over and said, with a few, in general, the United States has been pretty good at keeping its word. Sometimes we don't. We promised help to the South Vietnamese after we got out in '72, and we reneged on it. We promised that we were going to help the Afghans, and we reneged on that. Even Trump admits that he negotiated the sellout, if you want to call it that, in Afghanistan. Probably had to happen, should have happened. Oh, but I would have handled it better. Biden handled it poorly. Well, okay, it could have been just as poor under.
Yeah. But there's no scenario where the Afghan government in any way withstands the withdrawal. Like, those deals were already made.
As the deal was done,
yeah,
by a guy I know very well, under Trump, you go back and read the agreement, look what's going on. From that moment on, the Afghans knew we were getting out of there. And so they had free play.
Yeah.
Free play.
Yeah.
Well, fine. I don't have any problem with that, and everybody makes a meal of it, etc. But Putin knows we're more likely to keep our deal because we have a lot more in stake in making sure it happens. And in fact, you get a decent negotiation going, and you do agreements and side agreements and all that kind of stuff. Like when you got to Camp David, I was doing Europe at the time. I took over the Carter Middle East account, Arab-Israeli account, after the peace treaty. But the way the deals get done, you have your guys off in a corner and they say, we can't put this in the main agreement. We'll put this in the side agreement. You can get it all done. And they're creative people. We have a lot of creative diplomats in this country. A lot of creative diplomats in Europe. A lot of creative diplomats in Russia. Mr. Lavrov hadn't been around for nothing. His deputy hadn't been around for nothing. A guy I know, I've interacted with. These are pretty smart people. There's some pretty smart Ukrainians that I've dealt with. In fact, on the 20th anniversary of the NATO-Ukraine Charter, there was a big ceremony in the parliament in Kyiv. I spoke there in the parliament about the 20th anniversary. Okay, so you can do this. Give me a month. Now I'm going to tell you one thing, even though the Secretary of State, Mr. Rubio, who wants to be president. Of course, we have a mixed record of secretaries of state becoming president. Jefferson made it, for example. Hillary didn't. John Kerry didn't. Okay. But Rubio wants to be president. Okay. So he's going to have to calculate what happens to keep from being denounced by the president. And then hoping, I suspect Rubio hopes that the Democrats will win 2 years from now. But I'll tell you something. Could Trump just quit NATO? He hinted at it over the weekend. All right, it was hinted. Do you know why we can't quit NATO? Here we go. The NATO treaty says, look it up. It's a very short document. April 4, 1949. It says any state can quit the treaty, quit the alliance, on 1 year's notice. And that is in the gift to the President of the United States. He could say today, on the 4th of March, we're getting out of NATO. And the 4th of March next year, we're out of NATO. Except for one thing. 2023, because there were some people who were worried that if Trump came back into office, he might just do that. We'd better pass a law which is a law signed by the president that says the following. The United States can quit NATO only the way we joined, with a 2/3 vote of the United States Senate, which you can never get. Okay. Now, there were two co-sponsors for this legislation, one Democrat, one Republican. Do you know who the Republican co-sponsor was?
No, tell me.
Senator Marco Rubio,
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
who's the Secretary of
But
State.
do we really believe that Donald Trump is in any way considering leaving NATO, though? I don't see that being the case.
He's not. Uh, he would get gang tackled if he tried to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get gang tackled. People would at some point. Somebody
Yeah.
said. In fact, one thing that Trump with his transactional stuff doesn't understand that all the stuff we're doing now with regard to the allies, and you got to spend more, and you got to just. He forgets something very, very fundamental.
Mm.
The NATO alliance is a cohesion based on a lot of things, which had a lot to do with common interests and common values and common behavior and things. A major element of that is economic. The United States may have a deficit in the balance of trade with the Europeans, and we do, but we gain a hell of a lot from access to European markets. The American business community, beginning with Mr. Trump, would howl if it came to really damaging that relationship.
Right. Right.
It's a leading trading partner after Canada. Our firms are absolutely dependent upon the relationship, economic relationship. Trump doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. Or he just thinks, I can bluff him and see what it goes. Well, what are we now at 4 o'clock in the afternoon here? 16 hours ago, tariffs went in on Canada and Mexico, 25% tariffs.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
Now, beside the doubling of tariffs with China, 10 to 20%. Our enemy is only 20%. Two of our closest allies is 25%. And Mexico will probably have to take it sitting down. But the Canadians, you can't take institutional relationships, human relationships, political relationships, government relationships, built up over decades with everybody knowing one another, working with one another. One of the great things about being involved in international things, you meet somebody in a meeting when he's 25 years old, the two of you.
Yeah.
And when you're 55 years old and in charge, you meet the same guy and you already have a friendship built up. You can't throw that out the window, as unfortunately Mr. Trump is doing.
Yeah. But again, he got
Just
elected, so he gets to direct these things, right? But there is cost to all of this stuff, right?
big costs.
Yeah.
Well, I think you give me a month and I can correct the whole thing.
Well, you know what?
Or
You get a month.
If you want me to do it, if you want me to do it, I can find you at least a dozen other people who could do it.
Yeah.
You won't find them in the Washington Post, New York Times, because they're censored.
Yeah. When you were trying to talk with the last administration, they weren't all that receptive to your being involved, even though you've got decades of doing this kind of work. Do you even have a desire to work with the Trump administration? And would they say yes to you if you offered to help fix this thing in a month or whatever it is?
Never say yes. And if a president of the United States calls up and said, will you help me out in a serious job? There's only one answer. Yes.
It's yes, of course, right.
We had James Mattis was Secretary of Defense under the first Trump. There was a very talented woman who held senior jobs for the Democrats. Mattis asked her to come and be his deputy, and she said no. Big mistake. Big mistake. You say yes. Now, I would have to have some terms and conditions. There'd have to be access to the president, number one, with no interference, and a serious mandate. If he said, come in, get a decent team, you got to have some of my folks on it, got to have Mr. Musk belonging to it. I give you a month to settle this thing, and I'll back you up. Of course, I'd say yes. But if you came in and said, I want you to be ambassador to Slobovia, Lower Slobovia, Solsona, you remember Al Cap and Little Abner? Okay. Lower Slobovia. Of course, you don't do it, but it's got to be serious. You help. We have one country and one president at a time, and people with experience are supposed to say yes. Now, Biden, God love him, and I'm very fond of the guy for going back to when he was almost first in the Senate. wasn't comfortable with people he wasn't comfortable with. His entire senior team, with a couple of exceptions, the head of the CIA, were people he'd worked for him for years, but who never said no to him and never had any real cred when it came to be serious thinkers. Brings him in,
Yeah.
and instead of then saying, "Now, I got you guys, you're in charge. Now reach out." Henry Kissinger even had his people reach out. Big Brzezinski and Carter, for whom I worked all 4 years, said, "Reach out, get me the outsiders I need." And we'd say, "I don't know everything I need to know, but I can find somebody and I'll bring in and we'll listen to them." Biden refused to do that. Refused to do that.
Yeah.
Well, and as a result, when he got in trouble, a lot of people who would otherwise support him didn't. One reason for bringing people in, even to meetings in the White House, okay? I've been doing this since Lyndon Johnson, right? You bring people into a meeting with the White House, with the president, right? He turns off his hearing aid. He doesn't even listen to you. But then they go out and say, "As I said to the president," and you've got somebody who's likely to be friends with you. Instead of saying, "Well, he never bothered seeing me."
Yeah.
The media used to be like that. They co-opted presidents. He would give them secret leaks and all that stuff. Nowadays, the media has totally failed
Yeah.
by not being willing to report things as they really are, rather than get their millions of dollars all the way to the bank.
Yeah. Yeah. The media, as it was structured, is disappointing. You know, there's different ways to get these stories out. You and I can have this conversation. I'm curious how you look. I don't think highly of people like Susan Rice and Anthony Blinken. I think they've made too many mistakes. I think they'll continue to make mistakes because they're on the wrong path. Maybe they're good people. I'm sure that their neighbors love them, but they've been wrong. And the time for change has come. I would never hire these people to advise Zelensky. I'd be like, these are not the people to advise you. So Zelensky hired you and said, "Advise me."
Yeah, the other day I saw Susan Rice interviewed, and I was smart. I was shocked. She said smart things.
What?
I was shocked. Yeah.
I legitimately I believe you, but like my brain is like, no, that's not possible. You're telling me that she said cagey things on TV? She didn't just go talking points? That's amazing to me.
It was smart things. A lot of these people aren't dumb.
Well, yeah, no, she's not dumb, but they've been wrong.
An amazingly deep pool of people. Amazingly deep pool of people. Presidents need to reach out and find them. I have a line for everything based on many years' experience at the top of the government. And one of Hutter's rules is this: if there's anything you want to know, except what dictator X had for breakfast this morning, there's somebody in the United States government who knows it.
Sure.
The task is two-part. One, find that person, and then listen to him or her. The first part's easier than the second part, because when people get in a situation room or the cabinet room with the president, it changes the conversation.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. President. No, Mr. President. Get the president out of the room and they'll have a different conversation. This
is true. This is any of the boss, any boss level person, like when the generals would come out to the hinterlands in Afghanistan, Iraq, they were so irrelevant. It almost like you didn't want them to talk. And so I would just climb up until they were gone back. Okay, now we can get back to work, because they would wave their arms and talk about the future and everything. It's like, you are so, it was just, they warped reality when they showed up, whether it was good or bad or whatever it was, they definitely changed things. What would your advice be to Zelensky going forward? That's what I'm really curious what you're going to say about this.
I would do more or less what he's doing. He has gone to the point of saying, "I definitely want this to start. I want to negotiate." He was, I think, smart in going to London and got the prime minister on board. And then they had that meeting of the Europeans, and they say, "We're prepared to do X, Y, and Z." What I regret deeply is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, with all the special relationship didn't say, apparently, as far as we know, to Trump in private, and certainly not what he said to Parliament. Mr. Trump, we want to support you, but you got to do some following things. He said some things that the 4-point program I don't have in my head what we're going to follow. He said it to Parliament yesterday, but none of it includes we're going to have America come out with no qualifications in support of Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is, one should read it. Okay.
Yeah.
Trump sort of said that the other day, but he won't say it clearly. Article 5 of the treaty is very, very simple.
Yep.
It's the Three Musketeers thing, which is any NATO country that is invaded, everybody is in a state of war with the enemy. Okay.
Right.
Doesn't require you to do anything. No requirements. It then says, and each country in its own sovereignty, each member of NATO, will then decide what it wants, if anything, to do.
Right.
But at least at that point, you got something to work with. And so I would.
Does Trump have to say that, though? I mean, by being part of NATO, we've certainly never backed away from any, I don't know how many times we've invoked that or anyone has, but.
No, never. In NATO's entire history of 75 years, after taking a decision by consensus, no ally has, some haven't taken part, but no ally has ever fallen off the bus.
Right.
No ally ever has fallen off
the bus.
So
does he need to even say it then? I mean, does he need to say the obvious?
If I revisit this and follow off, when I need NATO, maybe it won't be there. It's never happened.
Right. Yeah. And also nobody's ever left NATO, right? Like there's these concerns, but they're sort of fabricated, it seems like.
Nobody's ever left NATO and you can't throw them out. There's no means of throwing them out.
Right.
Now in 1967, we had the Greek colonels and they were thoroughly misbehaving. They were a bunch of fascists, all right? And so for a time, important papers just didn't happen to be sent to them. And there was some exercises. They just didn't happen to get invited till 73 when they changed, and then everybody was hunky-dory again. And right now, everybody's trying to figure out what do we do with Ukraine, with Hungary, which is more an ally of Putin than it is of the West. Okay.
And, he aligns with the right, and that doesn't make the left comfortable, right? It's a hard thing. So if he's running Hungary how he chooses to, that's what he's elected to do, and he looks at it from a conservative point of view, that makes it hard for him to get along with us as a nation, because we've had a lot of left-leaning folks who are like, not a chance. It's a similar problem that we see with other leaders, like Netanyahu has been the primary prime minister the last 30 plus years. That's because they want him there. He continues to win. He continues to run that country, but we have a big political problem with him being there. Now, look, his behavior and other things aside,
we're switching.
Part of his problem is politics with us and how we see things. And the same thing is true.
Netanyahu, and I'll let him decide this, is if he stopped being prime minister, he'd go to court. He might go to jail. Okay.
Well, Zelensky's in the same spot, right? I mean, his government has done a lot of illegal things.
He wouldn't get indicted for anything. He hasn't committed any crimes, or let's say potentially committed crimes, which I'll say about Netanyahu. I know Netanyahu incidentally. I met him back when he was #2 at the Israel embassy. I remember taking him to lunch.
You know everybody.
He was a moderate back then in the 80s.
Yeah.
So I know him. Well, also, to stay in power, he's had to give all this weight to the right, which means, for example, all that's been done in Gaza, which now looks like a German city from World War II. Okay?
Yeah.
German city from World War II. He has indulged the right-wing settlers in the West Bank and allowing them, and Trump's letting them get away with it, and so was Biden actually, moving in the direction of absorbing the West Bank. I'll tell you, they do that, they'll never have peace, never. Because the idea of taking the Palestinians and moving them somewhere else, I mean, you can't even do that with Californians, much less Gaza. Can you imagine if you took everybody and everybody who suffered through those fires in Los Angeles say, I'm sorry, you can't come back
Yeah.
here. You're going to have to go and live in part of North Nevada.
Legitimately, though, when there are no, I mean, they walk the earth, but there are no Rhodesians anymore. That country got erased off of the map, and the people got ejected, right? And so there's an outcome, the Rhodesians, and so that country got evaporated. And if Gaza and the Palestinian government, whatever that is, if they can't get along, there's a real chance that ends up being the thing. I'm not saying it's a likely chance, but this has happened before. There's also no Chaldean state. There's no Yazidi state. There's no Kurdish state.
Our people have been here for a couple of thousand years.
Yeah.
If you're a Palestinian, you could say, our people have been here for a couple of thousand years. Okay?
Yeah.
You can't win that fight. I've done that for 45 years.
Yeah.
On that. And I have a little saying on that. You name a date for me, beginning with the Balfour Declaration on the 2nd of November, 1917 to today, and say, this is the date in which history starts.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'll tell you on that basis, who's right? The Arabs, the Palestinians, or the Israelis?
Oh, yeah.
Give me another date. Give me another date. It might come out the reverse. Fighting the history doesn't work. And there are an awful lot of, if you had a free vote in Israel and among Palestinians, free vote without conflict with everybody feeling under desperate threat, there would be a strong majority for making a peace based on a two-state solution. Strong majorities. But you can't do that right now.
Yeah. It doesn't appear possible in the near future either. They just don't.
I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah.
I think I have been a supporter of Israel for a long time, and I'm a Zionist in that sense, home for the Jewish people, okay? People forget the Balfour Declaration is one sentence. One sentence. Her Majesty's government will look with, I'm going to paraphrase, look with favor on the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, be it understood that this must not be at the expense of the indigenous people living there, and also that efforts should be made to help Jewish communities in Europe. The third, of course, was destroyed by Hitler. The second has just been ignored by the Israelis. But that's the Balfour Declaration, all right? But anyway, so again, give me a month. And not even me. I can find you 1,000 Israelis and 1,000 Palestinians who could sit down at a table and work this out very promptly, if the politics were right, because they all want to get beyond it except. Yeah, the establishment of Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That's probably the exact words. But then also, that's in the crawler. But also put the second phrase in there too. And incidentally, this was one of the worst agreements ever came up with. It was done on the 2nd of November, 1917, okay? 5 days before the Great October Revolution, because they were using the old Gregorian calendar then, Julian calendar, I'm sorry, in which the Bolsheviks took over and got rid of Kerensky and all that. But one reason the British did it was not just the effort by Weizmann and others, is because they were looking for support from the Russian Jewish community to keep Russia in the war, okay? So they had a good policy for 5 whole days. Sorry, sometimes these things don't have a long shelf life. It's tragic for everybody. But if you want to work out something for that, we could do it. We could do it. Right now, what Trump has clearly done, and I'm sure the first part of it, which is a continuation of Biden. I'm not sure, and of Trump won. I'm not sure the second part. Let me say it. First part is, Mr. Netanyahu, you can do whatever you want, provided, and here, that's the first part. Second part is, provided you don't start a war with Iran into which we would get
Yeah.
engaged.
Yeah.
Not going to put American forces on the ground, and I'm not going to get involved in attacks on Iran such that Iran will come and lash out at Americans who are based in the Middle East. We've already had some of that, but
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
a free president. So I'm not confident of the second part of that statement. I am confident of the first because that's what's happening. Because whether you like it or not, I'm not. One of the things in this business is you make moral judgments. We're all moral characters. But when you're doing the negotiations, you first have to say, what can work to achieve a goal? All right. You make your moral judgments along the way, but you got to deal with reality. Deal with reality. People say, what is it with presidents? What model of foreign affairs do they operate with? There's only one, the realist model. That's the world. New president comes in, the world doesn't change just because we have a president. They don't care who the president is. They still have to deal with him or her and the United States. Interests are the same. But the same thing if I were to negotiate, or if somebody were to negotiate a genuine Arab-Israeli settlement, they would sit down and they'd work it out. Take a long time to implement because following the slaughter of October 7th and the reverse slaughter in Gaza,
Yeah.
bitterness out there is so deep right now on both sides.
Let
Understand?
me jump in before we wrap. I want to say this because
a
lot of times politics get in between what we're trying to do, right? And so you and I both know James Rosebush, your neighbor, and he is a Republican Reagan guy.
Who's this?
Your neighbor, James Rosebush.
Oh, yeah. Who
Right.
decided, I don't blame him, for a while he's going to keep his powder dry.
Yeah, right. But if you two were to go on one of your walks and talk about this, how far apart would you guys be on the solutions? Because I think people are going to be surprised at, like, this is every hill is a hill I have to die on. You guys are going to find a compromise, I imagine.
Jim and I started our walk like this, and by the time we got around the crescent once, be like this. By the time we got around the crescent twice like that, by the third time around, we'd be like this.
Yeah.
Because he's a realist. I'm a realist. He wants Trump to succeed. I want Trump to succeed. He prefers Republicans. I prefer a Democrat. He's more likely to cut some slack for Trump. I'm less likely to cut slack for Trump, and it was vice versa with Biden and Obama and the second Bush. Okay, but we both are realists. And frankly, if you sat the two of us down as the advisor to the President of the United States and let us bring up, I think we could help organize a team of people who could resolve in a month the Ukraine thing, and another month much of at least the framework for the Arab-Israeli thing, the Middle East thing. Of course, it's a heavy lifting because too many people have dug in. But it's not that there aren't smart people. It's not that there aren't smart ideas. They're all out there.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate you talking about that because it's easy to lose sight of the fact that, like, oh, he's a Democrat, so we dismiss. You say things, you're like, I'm going to say this, but it's going to get me in trouble with my friends. You say that stuff all the time, and so that's why it's great to talk to you because you show us how diplomacy is supposed to work. And you talk about the history of these things, and when someone says this is the point of time, right? Yeah, you're like, well, how about this time and this time? All of a sudden you're off the screen. Understanding what happens in the Balkans, like you can't pick a point in time. Because it's timeless there, and so there's always been conflict, and that's why you see that region still struggle. The Caucasus, when are they ever going to fully settle down? I don't know that it's possible because they're going to always be a beef there. But if you have people like Robert, like James, you have a chance.
I think
I'll let you finish it.
It can work, but the British Army has a classic saying. It's 3 parts, 3 bits of advice. Never volunteer, don't march on Moscow, and don't go to war in the Balkans. That's it.
Yes.
It's wonderful. That's one reason when I was at
Oh
NATO,
my God.
when I was at NATO, and I was trying to negotiate NATO airstrikes to try to stop the war. And I hear I was a plenipotentiary for the President of the United States. Sitting around the NATO table, I was the United States. Of course, everything had to get referenced back to the State Department, eventually the President, etc. And one of the toughest countries I had was the French.
Hmm.
I used to bring them around. The country that always stood against the use of NATO air power in Bosnia were the British. And it was only after Srebrenica, which was so horrendous,
Yes.
and after we had reformed all of NATO for the future, that it was finally possible to force the British to say, okay, we will allow NATO airstrikes. And in 18 days, the war stopped.
Hmm.
A single person has died in Bosnia since 1995. Okay?
Yeah.
Why?
It's remarkable.
Because it was all done right after that. Not by our chief negotiator, who didn't know what he was doing, but by smart people in various places.
Well, listen, I've had you for almost an hour and a half, and it's been wonderful. I always love talking to you. Hopefully, I'll be able to come out the East Coast and come sit and have lunch with you guys. But just thank you very much for doing this with us. Thank you for always digging in and being willing to explain a lot of these things, because we get lost in the news sometimes, and you're just great at this. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me tell you, I don't know a forum in this country, and unfortunately it's just me, and I wish Jim Rose was here because he'd push back on some things, where it's possible to have such a candid conversation.
Yeah.
And we suffer mightily from that. And the greatest culprit of all is the United States mainstream media.
Yeah. 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 You said it. All right. Hang on. I'll come right back and say goodbye to you, everybody else. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.